مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. In today's recitation, we concluded Surah At-Tawbah, in which the last part was a discussion in relation to the munafiqeen, the hypocrites, building a masjid. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala announced that this masjid was designed, it was not a masjid, but rather it was a place of causing difference amongst the Muslims and believers and causing fitna. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala announced, لَمَسْجِدٌ أُسِّسَ عَلَى التَّقْوَى مِنْ أَوَّلِ يَوْمٍ أَحَقُّ أَن تَقُومَ فِيهِ. The masjid that was built from the first day upon taqwa has more right that you stand in it, referring to Masjid Quba. And that was verse number 108 of Surah At-Tawbah. In the same way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the forgiveness of the 3 Sahaba who remained behind in the Battle of Tabuk, and Allah announced that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forgiven them for their mistake. And the last verses of Surah At-Tawbah mention how Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam, Azizun alayhi ma anittum, is very dear to him what happens to you, what affects you. Harisun alaykum bil mu'minina ra'ufur rahim. He's haris towards you. He's always yearning for his ummah. So this verse shows how fortunate we are to be from his ummah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala announced that if they turn away, فَقُلْ حَسْبِيَ اللَّهِ, then say, Allah is enough for me. There's none worthy of worship but him. Upon him is my trust. وَهُوَ رَبُّ الْعَرْشِ الْعَظِيمِ, and he is the Lord of the great throne. So that was the last verse of Surah At-Tawbah. In Surah Yunus, we have the recollection of many of the Anbiya alayhimu salatu wassalam. And therefore, today we'll specifically look at the discussion in relation to Sayyiduna Nuh alayhi salatu wassalam, whilst previously within the verses we also had discussion of the drowning of Fir'aun and the situation of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wassalam's nation. But inshallah we can discuss that at another point. Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wassalam, the dhikr of Sayyidina Nuh, the mentioning of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wassalam and the situation of his nation is spread across many verses of the Holy Qur'an. So I began with the notes discussing the age of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wassalam. The amount of years that Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam stayed amongst his nation was 950 years, but his age was above that. So, for example, some scholars have said that the full lifetime was 1,240 years. The propagation of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wassalam, he would call them with wisdom. He said, Inni lakum nadhirun mubin. Indeed, I am open herald of clear warnings to you, that you must Allah ta'budu illallah, that you should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He continuously called his nation to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone for 950 years. And he mentioned how the nation reacted to him. He said, قَالَ يَا رَبِّ إِنِّي دَعَوْتُ قَوْمِي لَيْلًا وَنَهَارًا. Oh my Lord, I invited my people night and day, and ثُمَّ إِنِّي دَعَوْتُهُمْ جِهَارًا فَلَمْ يَزِدْهُمْ دُعَائِي إِلَّا فِرَارًا. My calling did not increase them except in fleeing away. And whenever I call them so that you may forgive them, they always place their fingers into their ears, covered themselves with clothes, وَأَصَرُّوا وَاسْتَكْبَرُوا اسْتِكْبَارًا, and they remained stubborn and were extremely arrogant. So when Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam called these people continuously, in spite of that 950 years, only his close family members and a few people were amongst the believers. And these were the people who were saved from the flood. In relation to how many there are different statements, but the scholars have mentioned 78, whilst others have mentioned 80. What were the reasons for their disbelief? This is mentioned in the recitation today, that they said that فقال الملأ الذين كفروا من قومه ما نراك إلا بشرا مثلنا. We do not see you but as a human being like us. So seeing the prophets to be human beings like yourself is a sign of the previous nations who made this objection. Right? We see that you are a human being like us. That was one of their objections. And the other was وَمَا نَرَاكَ اتَّبَعَكَ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ هُمْ أَرَاذِلُنَا. And we do not see those who believe in you except those who are the lowest amongst us. Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam said to them in response, as is mentioned in Surah Al-A'raf, which is a surah that we've already recited, أَعَجِبْتُمْ أَنْ جَاءَكُمْ ذِكْرٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ عَلَى رَجُلٍ مِّنْكُمْ لِيُنذِرَكُمْ. Are you surprised that an advice come to you from your Lord through a man amongst you so that he may warn you and that you may fear? And in relation to the objection that you have the low, the people who are not of high status, people who are not wealthy, people who are not powerful with you, Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam answered about that, وَمَا أَنَا بِطَارِدِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. I'm not going to repel the Muslims. I'm not going to pull them or push them away. Indeed, they will meet their Lord. إِنَّهُمْ مُلَاقُوا رَبِّهِمْ وَلَكِنِّي أَرَاكُمْ قَوْمًا تَجْهَلُونَ. I find you people completely ignorant. So the ignorance of this nation continued, and they attacked Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam, as mentioned by Ibn Asakir, that they attacked Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, believing him to have passed away, and then Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam still came back to call them. Now, after all of this calling, Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam did dua for their destruction. But why did Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam do dua for their destruction? That is mentioned here, that in verse number 36 of Surah Hud. And this is a very important point, because some people describe the situation as such that Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam did dua against his nation because of their oppression towards him. But that's not the case. But rather, because Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam was told, as is mentioned in verse number 36, وَأُوحِيَ إِلَى نُوحٍ أَنَّهُ لَن يُؤْمِنَ مِنْ قَوْمِكَ إِلَّا مَنْ قَدْ آمَنَ. It was revealed to Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam that none of your people will become Muslims except those who have already accepted faith. فَلَا تَبْتَئِسْ بِمَا كَانُوا يَفْعَلُونَ. So do not grieve, do not be sad about what they do. So Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam did not do dua because they were swearing at him, or because they did threats towards him, or that they commanded for him to be stoned, as is mentioned in many verses, including the verses that are coming inshallah in the future. The only reason for this supplication was that Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam was aware that none of them would now believe. Those who have accepted belief have accepted. Apart from that, those who were apart from them, they would cause nothing but trouble. So Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam did dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroy them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam to build the ship. وَاصْنَعِ الْفُلْكَ بِأَعْيُنِنَا وَوَحْيِنَا وَلَا تُخَاطِبْنِي فِي الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. And build the ship in front of us and by our command, and do not speak to me regarding the unjust. They will surely be drowned. So Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam, when he was building this ship, in verse number 38 is mentioned, وَكُلَّمَا مَرَّ عَلَيْهِ مَلَأٌ مِّن قَوْمِهِ. And whenever the chiefs of his people passed by him, سَخِرُوا مِنْهُ, they would make fun out of him. قَالَ إِن تَسْخَرُوا مِنَّا. He said, if you make fun out of us, and you laugh at us, فَإِنَّا نَسْخَرُ مِنْكُمْ كَمَا تَسْخَرُونَ. Then the time will come when we will laugh at you just as you laugh. So they made fun out of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam and he's building this ship. But what do we learn in our life? That we may do things that people laugh at, that people make a mockery of, right? We worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we do sajda, non-Muslims make fun out of the sajda, or non-Muslims may make fun out of the way we dress, the non-Muslims may make fun out of the way we eat. All of these things that people who don't understand the deen and away from the deen make fun out of. In the world they may laugh, but on the day of judgment, when they are punished, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Mutaffifin that Allah will make the believers فَالْيَوْمَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنَ الْكُفَّارِ يَضْحَكُونَ. On this day, the believers will be laughing at the disbelievers. Right? So we've had many examples of even politicians making fun out of Islamic signs and Islamic way of life. Right? And this ignorance still exists till this day. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed the nation of Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will show all the oppressive nations how his wrath is severe. But Allah has given them opportunity in this world. He is most merciful. He's given them the opportunity to come back. And we hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings them back. Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam held on patiently for 950 years. He did not give up calling them. Right? That's the other lesson that we learn from Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. That for 950 years he did not give up. Right? We give up after 5 minutes. We give up after 5 times telling somebody. We give up after telling somebody 20 times. But Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam continued to carry out the duty of calling to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until it became clear that nobody else would now accept this call. Only then did Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam do dua for the destruction of the nation. There's many points that we've written down here, but those are the main points. Then the events that occurred are mentioned within these verses, the last verse that we recited today, including the overflowing oven, which is mentioned in verse number 40, that we حَتَّى إِذَا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا وَفَارَتْ النُّورُ, to the extent when our command came and the oven overflowed. قُلْ نَحْمِلْ فِيهَا مِنْ كُلٍّ زَوْجَيْنِ اثْنَيْنِ. So we said to ride upon it in twos. وَأَهْلَكَ إِلَّا مَنْ سَبَقَ عَلَيْهِ الْقَوْلُ. They were all destroyed except for those who Allah commanded not to be destroyed. And a flood came, as is mentioned in Surah Al-Qamar, فَفَتَحْنَا أَبْوَابَ السَّمَاءِ بِمَاءٍ مُنْهَمِرٍ. We therefore opened the gates of heaven with water flowing furiously. So the entire nation was destroyed apart from those who were believers. And amongst those who were disbelievers was Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam's wife. And inshallah we'll be discussing the situation of the prophets, certain prophets' wives, the 2 prophets, Sayyidina Nuh and Lut alayhim assalam, whose wives were disbelievers. And also was his son, as is mentioned in the verse number 46, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّهُ لَيْسَ مِنْ أَهْلِكَ. He is not of your family. إِنَّهُ عَمَلٌ غَيْرُ صَالِحٍ. His actions, his deeds are most improper. From this we also learn that the actual children and the actual relation are those who are believers. And if one does not have belief, and one's belief is flawed, then that person, even if he is a blood relation, there is no actual relation, and that relation will not benefit. So he might be related to a pious person, but he does not have good deeds, and he does not have good way of life, he does not act upon the deen, or his beliefs are distorted, then his relation to pious people will not save him. Because without belief, without iman, one cannot be saved. So that's mentioned by Sayyidina Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, rahimahullah, that Sayyidina Nuh's son Kan'an was a munafiq who used to portray himself to be a believer in front of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. This is why Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam did dua in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his son. Rabbi inna ibni min ahli, as he mentioned in verse 45, that, oh my Lord, my son is from my family. وَإِنَّ وَعْدَكَ الْحَقِّ, and indeed your promise is truth. وَأَنْتَ أَحْكَمُ الْحَاكِمِينَ, and you are the judge of all judges. So Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam did that dua based upon his son's showing himself to be apparently a believer. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that the actions of his son were not good, he was a disbeliever. And the status of religious proximity is foremost. If this is attained, then this shall benefit. Otherwise, there shall not be any benefit. And unfortunately, in our society, we have people who think that simply being the child of a pious person is the means for their forgiveness and makes them qualified without working hard to represent the deen. So this was the destruction of this nation mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the verses that we recited last today to verse number 49. And inshallah, from tomorrow, a number of nations will be mentioned in Surah Hud, and then we'll be going on to Surah Yusuf, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for any errors. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward all who are listening and attaching themselves to understanding the Holy Quran. Amin bijahi Nabi al-Kareem. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم.